CEO Wisdom Pod with Scott Stout. He is CEO and co-founder at MedVector. We're going to talk about clinical trials. His company, MedVector, is actually accelerating or improving that. Scott has an interesting background in high finance. Quite excited to talk to him. Scott, can you introduce yourself, say a little hello, and tell us a bit more about MedVector?
Sure. My name is Scott Stout. I'm the CEO of MedVector, and we work, as you mentioned, in the clinical trials arena, which is very, very broken. And one of the things that people don't realize about this industry and why it's so challenging is the average time to market to get a new medication to market is 10 to 14 years. And so there's a conflict there because there's a patent behind that medicine that's only a 20-year patent. Okay. So waiting 10 to 14 years to get to market, this is why drug prices are so high, is because those drug manufacturers need to recuperate all of their R&D costs, all their clinical trial costs, all of these costs, and they have such a small window to do it. So they're highly motivated to expand that window by running the clinical trials and getting to market more quickly. Okay. Well, there's an interesting catch-22 that exists between the FDA and HIPAA. So HIPAA is the privacy law where you can't buy or sell healthcare data. So the FDA says, well, you can't market a new medication until you have our approval. And so in order to get the FDA's approval, you have to do clinical trials. So you have to find people to prove that your medicine works, right? So you have to prove efficacy and patient safety. Well, how do you find patients to test your medicine on if you can't buy a list of people who have X? So this is where the big catch-22 comes in. So clinical trials would recruit much faster if they could buy a list of people who potentially needed it, but they can't. And they also can't market the medicine. So you can't put up a billboard that says, ask your doctor about X. Instead, you have to say, do you have X? Call this phone number. Charles, when was the last time you dialed a phone number off a billboard?
Never.
Yeah, you and everybody else. So that's why this industry takes so long to get things to market. Now, the value of these patents, this blows everyone's mind. So Humira is a medicine that a lot of people have heard of, okay? Their patent just expired. The value of Humira's patent, we know now. And this is taking their last year's sales and subtracting this year's forecast, their own forecast that they send to investors. So the delta between those two numbers is $20.5 million a day.
Holy moly.
A day. So when you start thinking about that, do you think that they're motivated to get to market more quickly? You bet.
Yep.
Do you think that they'd pay $1 billion to extend their patent protection 1 month? Yep.
So how do they do that?
Well, so they can't do that right now. So the piece that everybody agrees on is if we could find patients for clinical studies more quickly, similar to the COVID vaccine, right? That happened very quickly because we found patients very quickly. Everybody was very aware of the problem. So the entire industry agrees if we could find patients more quickly, the typical timeline for a new medication getting to market should be like 3 to 5 years. So how do we connect that dot? This is where the problem exists, is there's this catch-22 between finding patients and having access to patients. And that's where our solution comes in, okay? So essentially what MedVector, my company, does is we've recognized that every patient is tethered to a doctor in some form. Whether you have a GP or not, you're tethered to a clinic and a physician that has treated you in one situation or another during the course of your life. So every patient that potentially we identify for a clinical study is tethered to a treating physician. Well, there's this new concept called clinical trials as a care option, which sounds great. How do we get our doctors to use advanced medicine to treat their patients? Well, there were 350,000 clinical studies registered on clinicaltrials.org. or .gov, sorry. So there's too many out there for everybody to understand what is available and what's in the pipeline. And then you've got clinical trial sites that are like kind of pop-up locations. So you have to, be lucky enough to be living close enough to one of those in the first place. So you have to be close to one, you have to know about one, and you have to have a doctor that's going to tell you about it. And so this is very challenging. So the next component of it that creates a roadblock is doctors aren't allowed to take kickbacks for referrals, right? So that violates what's called Stark law. And so you can't give a kickback to a doctor for the referral. So how do you align the incentives between a treating physician that's going to refer the patient to a clinical study and the clinical study who needs the patient? So we sing to doctors and ask them to, refer out of the goodness of their heart. And some of them do. But for the most part, most clinical studies are direct to patient. And that's why they take so long. So it's sign up to our website to learn about this clinical study, right? Or the billboard that's, do you have X? Call this number. And so what MedVector does is we found out a way to align these incentives between the treating physicians and these investigator teams to where they can refer their patients and they can host the clinical trial appointments from their own practice virtually without giving them away physically.
That looks complicated though. Do they have like rooms and space and the staff and the resources to do that?
Well, yes. So the clinical trial sites themselves, most of them are dedicated. So they're not a physician practice that also does clinical trials. Most of them are dedicated clinical trial sites. So they are hungry for more patients because that's where their profitability comes from. Now, when we think about a treating physician's office, a lot of times we know that they're working at capacity. So we say, well, how are they going to take time out of their day and give up an office space for somebody to participate in a clinical study from their practice? It's a great question. Well, so let's think about how do most doctors operate in major metropolitan areas? They typically have multiple offices, right? And they'll work Mondays and Wednesdays from one facility and Tuesdays and Thursdays from another facility, and then use Fridays as either a day off or a billing day or any number of things, right? So we have offices where the doctor isn't there, but it potentially has a full staff. So another example of this is, let's think about a surgical practice. So a surgeon makes the most money when they're in surgery. So they're motivated to spend as much time as possible in surgery. Well, when these surgeons still have practices, and so when they're in surgery, what happens to the practice? Well, the practice sits idle for the most part with full staff, but the practice sits idle. So this is an opportunity for us to use those patient rooms to connect patients to clinical studies. And let me squash something quick. When people think about clinical trials, one of the first places that they go is being a guinea pig. I don't want somebody to test a medicine on me. We are so far past that. Right now, so the FDA doesn't even allow you to get into clinical studies until the data is already there and the computers are agreeing with it. So the clinical trials are really more for making sure that the dosage the computers are suggesting is tolerable, right? And looking for side effects that potentially we didn't know otherwise. So the efficacy of the medication has potentially already been proven in preclinical. And so this is just the final step before you can market a medicine. You have to prove that it works in humans, and you have to prove that it's safe in humans. So that's the two pieces of it. The majority. Go ahead.
Hyper bullish on the idea, I see Series A, so it's probably more than an idea. How much folks do you have on the platform right now?
Well, so we are still a startup, and we're working with major pharmaceutical companies. So the amount of patients that we've engaged is not something that I can share. But essentially, we are not, like, one of the big missteps that the industry has taken is they try to find the biggest database possible, thinking the more patients I have in the top of the funnel, the more enrollees I'll get at the bottom of the funnel. Medicine doesn't work like that. It's not a sales funnel. It's relationship based. So we work with the clinical trial sites and we ask them a singular question. We say, is there a local specialist that should be referring patients that isn't? The answer is yes, 100% of the time. In fact, it's yes with a story of frustration. It's yes, I can think of 5. And one of the doctors I've taken out to dinner 3 times, and each time she says she's got 10 patients for me and she's yet to refer any. Well, the reason that physician isn't referring is because they don't want to do a bunch of legwork and then give a patient away. And most doctors are genuinely concerned about their patients. And doctors will refer a patient when they know that they're no longer the best doctor to treat that patient. So this is when a GP will refer to a cardiologist, right? It's when they know that there's somebody else that can handle the patient better. That's when a referral happens. Well, a clinical trial isn't for care. It's for a single medication, right? So it's like referring a patient to a pharmacy. That's just weird. And then further, when we talk about specialists, typically specialists don't refer to other specialists. There isn't like a super specialist, right? So the concept of referring as a specialist is potentially foreign. So we get in there and we introduce ourselves to that specialist, that the relationship already exists to the clinical trial site. And we say, look, this is a way for you to generate revenue for your practice by hosting these clinical trial appointments from your practice, even though the clinical trial site is potentially across the street. And by facilitating those appointments from the practice, a lot of good synergies happen. The patient relationship exists with the physician, with the treating physician, not with the clinical trial site. So we want the patients to be participating with their treating physician.
Dan, I lost you. That time, yes, I called you Dan. But Scott, I lost you. Your sound got off. I don't know why.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now it's back. It's funny, right? Because when we started this call, you asked if I called you Dan, and now you like kind of planted that in my brain, and then I called you Dan for real. How about subconscious psychology right there? But yeah, go on. I lost you for the 7 last seconds.
Okay, so essentially what we do is we introduce ourselves to the treating physician, and we want the treating physician, we want the patient to be with their treating physician when they're participating in a clinical study, because that's where the relationship exists. And when we engage our doctors are the gatekeepers to other patients. And when they see a medicine working with less side effects, well, they have other patients just like you that then they can refer it to as well. So it's almost a way for a doctor to prescribe a clinical trial. It's almost a way for a doctor to prescribe a medication that isn't available for prescription yet.
Right. I have a bunch of thoughts that popped. If doctors are human, they also care about money. Fact is, I see a lot of surgeons with Lambos. So yeah, they're still driven by that. So I'm like, why is the government preventing that? But yeah, humans may abuse of that power. Then the question just came, are AI bots going to replace doctors in that matter? Probably yes. But then the most interesting question, and you can touch on each, it's up to you where you want to take this, but I just talked with Dan Desjardins, who was my last guest, and we talked about in silico, right? In silico studies. And by the way, just for background, my first company was a nootropic, and we did some studies on mice, not on humans, but that was the next step. We're about to do clinical trials on them. So quite familiar with the industry. But then my brain is like, why don't we do that in silico? When do you think this is going to happen? Because to me, it seems like, yeah, using your body to make money, it's kind of in this shady category. I understand why some folks would do it, especially if they need the money to do some productive things. But I'm just not sure how long it's going to last. And obviously, there's the FDA in it, and FDA is incredibly slow moving. But when do you think in silico tests and simulations will be able to run with the FDA's approval?
Well, so the FDA actually isn't slow moving, and it is not a political machine. The FDA writes guidance, And then the industry needs to create what they consider a defensible position based off that guidance. And the FDA is concerned primarily about three things. It's efficacy, patient safety, and data integrity, right? So that's pretty much everything. So if you can prove that something is working, then you have their support. And also, you said that, who is going to want to be paid to be participate in a clinical study? Well, that's getting back to the guinea pig mentality. So most people that are participating in clinical studies need it. So, this is a cancer vaccine, or this is an AIDS vaccine, or this is a Hep C vaccine. But so when we think about every medicine that we put in our body, they've all gone through clinical trials. So, to get aspirin early, great. To get penicillin early, great.
Right.
But
Is that like the 80% of patients? Because me in my mind, I wouldn't call it guinea pig, but it's like people that need extra income that go and do these studies. Me as a somewhat elite person, if something would happen to me, first, I'm connected, so I just reach out to the best doctors of this world. I don't think I'd end up in any clinical trials. It seemed a pretty desperate thing to do.
Well, so you're referring to phase 1, which are professional patients. The majority of clinical study candidates are not that. The vast majority. So when we're talking about a phase 1, and phase 1 isn't experimentation, but it is with a healthy patient, and they are compensated, and it is a toxicity screening, and that's basically all that it is. It requires tens of people, not hundreds of people, tens of people, right? The next phase, so phase 2, is all about statistical significance. So you've got the placebo, and then you've got the active ingredient, and is there a difference between the two subject groups? Both of these subject groups typically are on the standard of care medicine at the same time. Typically, not always. Okay. So these are people that need it, right? So these aren't professional patients that are saying, sure, try it on me. These are people that have the ailment and potentially have a horrible side effect with the standard of care that exists today. So this is something that they'd be interested in. Phase 3 is then everyone has the active ingredient, and it's all about efficacy. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much better do you feel? Right? So that concept of, I would never participate in a clinical study because I don't want to be a professional guinea pig, that's actually not accurate. And the data that's out there actually suggests that 75% of patients would participate in a clinical study if it was recommended by their doctor.
Interesting. And how far are we from AlphaFold running simulations and making advancements and clinical studies, drastically reducing the time it takes from 10 years to 1 day?
Well, all of that is preclinical, right? So all of the computer components and the data modeling, that's all preclinical. So that timeline is already accelerating, and that's great. The way that we accelerate the clinical trials component, which is the human testing aspect, is patient recruitment. So it's, how do we create access to patients? So patient access is what I consider a two-way street. And when we think about patient access, the first side of the street that everybody jumps to is, how do we make it easier for patients to participate, right? Well, there's a more important side of the street that we forget about, and it's not access for patients, it's access to patients. How do we get patients to build awareness? How do we make them feel safe and protected while participating, right? How do we create this access? And the way that we create this access is by engaging our treating physicians. And so we are one of the only companies that is doing it. And we are the only company that's doing it this way. And so MedVector at scale has the potential to change how we recruit clinical trials forever.
I think that's the right way to do it. I mean, it's the most practical and rational way to do it. And it's interesting because you operate in the realm of non-financial incentives, which
Yep.
Like nowadays, I don't have anyone that's not a capitalist on this podcast, for the simple reason that not thinking in money is just counterproductive to your own well-being. Doctors, yes, they do care about their patients, their well-being. They do have a sense of accomplishment and of self-value if they did cure that person or not. And yet, I guess that's the right way to do it. Talking about the business itself, are you raising funds? What are the next steps here for you?
So yes, we're actually, you can see behind me, we're going into our Series A. And so, yeah, we're raising 5 to 10 million from institutional capital right now. And we've begun that process. So this is an exciting time around here.
And where can people find out more about you, Scott?
Well, so interestingly enough, I discovered this last week that you can actually Google Scott clinical trials and I come up, which is pretty neat. In fact, I come up before Scott Gottlieb, who was a commissioner of the FDA. So, we're making some waves in what we're doing, but the name of the company is MedVector. So like medicine and then vector. So it's the direction of medicine. So it's www.medvector.com. And you can learn about how we work and see some explainer videos and see how we're going to change the world.